This week's podcast is brought to you by Avast, a global leader in digital security and family safety solutions for network operators and their customers. Consumers are more connected than ever. Over 66% of North American households now have at least one Internet of Things device. But whether they're using a doorbell camera, online fridge, voice-activated assistant, or even just a mobile phone and laptop, each device further exposes them to attacks on their digital security and privacy. Avast's advanced AI-driven security can be deployed at the device, router, or 5G network level to provide a comprehensive and fully converged solution powered by the world's largest consumer threat detection network. Their award-winning security solutions make it easy for consumers to manage their digital life security using just one simple interface, no matter how many devices they use. That's smart. Let Avast help you build a safer digital home for your customers. Discover more at avast.com/partners. That's avast.com/partners. Welcome to the Light Reading Podcast. This is Phil Harvey. I'm an editor here at Light Reading, and I'm joined on this podcast by my colleague, Kelsey Zeiser, and our guest today is Nick Feamster. Nick is the director for the Center for Data and Computing at the University of Chicago. He's been on the podcast before. He helps explain what's going on with the internet itself and how it fits into society and what's changing. And we thought it'd be a great time to have him on because his group is starting to do some research into the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic in not just in the nature and the scale of the traffic that's affecting the internet, but how network operators might be responding to the changes that we're seeing in society, not just on a network basis, but on a societal basis as well. It's a pretty interesting discussion, and we will cover all facets of the shift in the location, the nature, and the scale of network traffic right after this. So welcome to the podcast, Nick Feamster of the University of Chicago. Thanks for joining us.
Very happy to join you today.
So you have spent a good bit of your career trying to make the internet work better. If I may go so far as to just summarize your entire career.
Thanks. Yeah, that was a good, quick summary.
Yeah, I'm all about brevity these days. So I wanted to talk about a new project you're involved in, but one of the things that everyone is, especially in the telecom industry, is talking about is how the network has been performing, how the internet's been performing as these stay-at-home and teleworking requirements have taken hold. How do you feel like this COVID-19 pandemic has affected the network overall?
Just starting from the basics and stating the obvious, people are staying home, and so essentially that changes access patterns in a number of interesting ways. The obvious one, of course, is that people are using their home networks more. They're using their home networks for work and also for school in many cases. And even those of us who aren't in school or aren't working, such as the elderly population, are also relying on the internet more to maintain contact with family members, loved ones, caregivers, and so forth, whereas previously they might have been not so reliant on those technologies. So I think everybody is using their home network more than they were. There's also something interesting going on too that's happening less, which is mobility. And if you think about, say, a cellular network, typically has to deal with a lot of mobility, people moving their phones around as they move around in cars and bikes and on foot. And there's a lot less mobility that we're seeing in the cellular network as well.
Yeah, so the combination of the two makes for an interesting, I guess, interesting. Uh, I don't want to say displacement, but the traffic has moved to a different, maybe moves around the network in a much different way now.
Has certainly traffic patterns have certainly shifted, and I think the access networks in particular too have seen an increase in traffic, particularly at certain times of day when they're typically not used to seeing those increases. You know, when we're typically at work or school, we're now at
Mm-hmm.
home, and we're not only at home, we're at home using the internet all day long.
Mm-hmm. I thought it was interesting you bring up mobility because I've gotten a few. I have Verizon got a few notifications on my cell phone from them about increasing data at no extra charge, but I've seen people complain, "Well, I'm not going anywhere, so how does that help me?" I thought that was kind of interesting.
One of the things that is kind of interesting is that there are certain communities, certain populations that depend on mobile cellular
Mm-hmm.
internet more than more than others. Right. So for some people, their cellular connection is their primary internet connection at home.
Mm-hmm.
If
Mm-hmm.
they're typically relying on their school or their library or their place of work as the place where they, commonly use the internet. Um, and particularly, we talk about low income communities and others, they may not have a fixed line internet connection. Um, and hence they may be relying on cellular data at home. And when you're staying at home all day long, then you're going to, of course, put more strain on that network as well.
Yeah, I would think for first responders, the mobile network would be especially important right now. And I think AT&T's released some updates about their FirstNet network too. Yeah, I can definitely see both sides. And as you mentioned, for those that might not have great Wi-Fi at home, it's still going to be really important to have a good mobile access.
Absolutely. So I think increasing dependence on both types of technologies.
What are your other thoughts on the impact that COVID-19 has had on traffic volume factors? Talked a little bit about network performance, but also, application performance, user experience. What is some of your research showing about the impact on those factors?
The question is, how are these shifts in traffic patterns putting strain in different parts of that end-to-end path? And I think one thing that's, was already clear from some of our earlier research is that the user's home wireless network is very often a source of problems, a source of performance bottlenecks along that end-to-end path. And we haven't begun to look at that in our own studies yet, but I think we're certainly seeing some data from providers looking at the load on Wi-Fi networks and how that's increasing due to the fact that we're all staying home. For example, we've all set up home offices. Some of us have set up home schools, and suddenly there are a bunch more devices connected in the home network. And additionally, the devices may be connecting from weird places in the house that previously didn't have internet connected devices.
Like using the bathroom as a break room? That count?
Exactly. And so suddenly you're testing, you're putting additional strain on the Wi-Fi network. You're also testing, strange boundary conditions, if you will, within your home as far as the coverage of the network. So that's certainly one area where it was already a bad situation before COVID-19, and I think now with everybody staying home, it's only getting worse. For several years, we've been looking at data at the internet interconnections. That is the interconnections between the internet service provider and content provider, and looking at the utilization of those links that connect those two parts of the network. And for quite some time, I would say dating back almost 5 years, it was safe to say that those links were relatively well provisioned for the most part. Now, what's happened, I think, as a result of the current shifts in traffic patterns, these access networks are seeing significant growth in traffic demand over a very short period of time. Okay, so typically these networks are seeing something like 25 to 45% growth over the course of a year in terms of traffic on those, on those interconnects. And the service providers plan for that and will provision accordingly to plan for that type of growth. Now, suddenly, with everybody moving home and staying at home, if you will, the growth that was planned for has all been seen in the course of a month or a few weeks. And, so far, I won't say so far so good, so far okay, I think, because there was already a little bit of headroom in the network. It certainly, I think, remains to be seen, and this is something that we're continuing to look at, like, because some of that headroom has been used, we now sort of obviously want to look at how that continues to evolve over the coming months. The good news, I think, is that the internet service providers have reported, and actually for content delivery networks for that matter as well, have reported somewhat of a plateau in the last week or two, flattening the curve, if I may, on traffic demands, right? So it hasn't continued to skyrocket. As of a couple of weeks ago, there's been a little bit of a flattening. And that's probably good news for provisioning as well. It gives the engineers a little bit more time to add capacity to the network. I think the other thing that is evident from traffic patterns is that peak time used to be evenings and weekends in the home, and now peak time is pretty much all the time. It's pretty much from sun up to sundown. So I think those are the types of trends that are being reported in in sort of global internet traffic across the access networks and across the interconnects. We're sort of in the early days of our studies, and we'll be continuing to take a look at those kinds of data points, but certainly looking at the Wi-Fi network, looking at the interconnects as places that potentially are sources of strain, certainly worth continued examination.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that this, I think, pandemic has pointed out is, well, like you were saying with when we were talking about mobile internet, is that immediately it drew attention to, especially as it relates to kids going to school, communities that don't have adequate internet access and don't have, adequate connectivity. Once they're suddenly completely reliant on the internet for school, that becomes a big problem. Now schools have to make other arrangements to get them to different locations or something like that. It makes the whole thing, I guess it just underscores the importance of having internet access. As you're looking at even though the data is still, you're still early in looking at the data that's coming in from your study at the University of Chicago, do you feel like the shifting in our need for the internet is going to cause us to either put a different emphasis on capacity, reach, or maybe how the network itself is designed?
There was a lot in that question, so let me unpack a couple of things. You've touched on a number of really interesting points. One is sort of disparity in access, and another is how that disparity relates to network design. And there are a couple of other points in there as well. But those two really touch on, we're just getting started on this, but this will certainly be. Those two aspects are a major focus for us over the coming couple of months here at the University of Chicago and the Center for Data and Computing, where we do a bunch of interdisciplinary research in networking, in machine learning, and with applications to some of these policy and social issues. Let me give you an example. If you look at the Federal Communications Commission's broadband maps at broadbandmaps.fcc.gov, you get the impression that the city of Chicago is fairly well covered with gigabit internet access. And to make a long story short, it's a little bit more complicated than those maps would suggest. There's certainly significant disparities in access, particularly in lower income communities. And the interesting thing about Chicago is that some of those low income communities with poor internet access are also not very dense. And so it's not just a matter of let's go wire up an apartment building and we're done, or let's just stick up an omnidirectional antenna on the roof of the school and then we'll cover everyone. No, I mean, sometimes people are traveling miles to their schools and libraries. And so that creates some really interesting challenges technically. First, we need to understand what those gaps in access look like. But also, as you point out, I mean, as your question gets at with regard to network design, depending on what those gaps look like, we may need to get creative with solutions. Because if the area that's suffering this gap in access is fairly large, then building out infrastructure to that entire area, even if it's a wireless mesh network, is costly and complicated. And so we need to think about perhaps some more immediate near-term approaches, which might include things like drive-by Wi-Fi hotspots, places where students might go. Now, that kind of model is interesting because it's not typically how we think of content delivery on, a well-provisioned internet. You and I are talking over an always on, always connected type of infrastructure. I've got information at my fingertips here. The internet's well designed for that type of connectivity model. But when we think about this sort of intermittent connectivity that shows up in that scenario that I described, we're going to need to rethink everything from how applications behave to how teachers give assignments to students, where they can't necessarily assume always on connectivity.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because that is the assumption when people say internet access. They need access to Wi-Fi or whatever. The assumption is always that it's some sort of always on connection. But you raise a good point. Maybe there are models where internet by appointment makes more sense and economically and reaches more people than just not having them connected at all.
It's certainly an intermediate point. I mean, ideally, you'd like to get everybody connected all the time.
Yeah.
But there are logistical and technical and economic challenges there. And certainly it bears thinking about what intermediate designs might look like. And those are some ideas that we're talking about with our community partners here.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that there's a lot of like network, the network design part will come into this as well, because like you said, not every community that's that has poor internet access is easy enough to wire in the traditional ways that we've done it. And fortunately, the industry seems to be making strides in things like fixed wireless access and and there's some promise of better high bandwidth wireless access now that T-Mobile and Sprint have merged and things like that. So I guess what remains to be seen is how creative they'll be and how much they'll hold be accountable for those connectivity promises, because I think we're going to have to be wireless at some point to reach these rural areas.
Absolutely. And I mean, that sort of brings us back to some of our earlier discussions as well, because I mean, another thing that you mentioned was sort of, uh, you know, maintaining and operating a network with high reliability and performance. And there's a lot of interesting operational questions there. And I think some of them we've actually talked about on previous episodes of your podcast, where you can use machine learning models to try to detect or predict that a performance problem has cropped up in the network. Some of our own work, I think Kelsey had asked earlier about studying application performance, right? So there's an example where we look at the traffic and we apply machine learning models to determine what the performance of, say, a YouTube video or a Zoom call is.
Right.
But those models are all based on data that's, training data that may have been around, let's say, before the COVID-19 pandemic. And so when a situation like the one we're in occurs, that can completely shift the distributions in the data sets, and the old models are no longer valid. So, everything from predicting application performance to what cellular providers need to do in terms of, predicting data throughput or call drop rates, et cetera, those are all based on models where the traffic patterns were completely different than they are right now. And so, in addition to all the sort of operational strain that the network is experiencing as a result of these shifting traffic patterns, the models and tools, that were finely tuned for a previous era, may not be accurately predicting the performance and operational problems that we might see in the current regime. So there's some really interesting additional machine learning challenges there.
What do you see coming up next for service providers? What should they be planning for in the coming months? Maybe some folks will be slowly returning back to their offices. Also think personally in North Carolina, we're coming up on hurricane season. So, that could create some additional challenges as well. So what are your thoughts on how service providers can prepare for future network capacity?
That's a really good question, Kelsey. And I think it's worth noting that our new project with the National Science Foundation is geared towards understanding that. So looking at the current pandemic situation, what's happening with the network to better inform robust network design. Now, some of that, we talked about relates to how people are using the network in different ways. Such as the drive-by hotspot example that we talked about. Now, as far as people going back to work, or the next natural disaster, I think maybe there's some lessons to take away from that. I mean, I think one sort of bright spot in all of this is that the internet has performed extraordinarily well under the strain that we put it under over the last month or two. And I think that's a shining testament to the design of the original internet protocols. So I think that's good news.
And something I appreciate.
Now, absolutely. I mean, the fact that it's working so well, I think, is a testament to decisions that were made decades ago with regard to the design of TCP/IP and packet switching and so forth. I think an area that we've already talked about a little bit, where I think probably we're going to need to pay a little bit more attention is in the wireless realm, right? So I think one specific example of that would be the home Wi-Fi network. Right? As more devices are crowding the network, the obvious solution there, of course, is to add more spectrum. But the Wi-Fi network is, of course, unlicensed spectrum, and there's a need to potentially open up more unlicensed spectrum to make room for the additional devices that are increasingly dependent on Wi-Fi. And I think that's sort of something that is sort of borne out in the data that some of the providers have reported. They've seen, you know, significant declines in LTE data usage and a corresponding increase in, mobile data usage over the Wi-Fi hotspots. So I think Xfinity, for example, has reported those kinds of trends. But the corollary there is that we got to make room in the Wi-Fi network for more devices and more usage. And I think this is something that the Federal Communications Commission is already thinking about with the 6 gigahertz band. But certainly spectrum is one area. I think the other stories, I think, are well, we've been living them, I think, through every natural disaster. Really comes back to, I think, what we were talking about right before the podcast, as far as provisioning and redundancy. I mean, it's good news that there was so much headroom on the interconnects, right? That wasn't the case back in 2013. We all remember the Netflix debacles back in that day, and if the interconnects were running at 90+% capacity right before this had happened, then I think we would have seen a very different situation. So it's good that that providers continue to provision capacity at those interconnects, and I think certainly maybe now, whereas before there was planning just for growth, right? This standard growth. It might also behoove us to think about planning for, provisioning in instances like this. I mean, now we have a very, very helpful natural experiment of like what happens when there's a massive traffic shift from, one set of endpoints to another. And so that will certainly help people as they sort of plan with their provisioning models.
Yeah. So it sounds like in some ways this is kind of I guess to put a brighter spot, like a researcher's dream to see this in real time.
It's a very interesting natural experiment, right? I mean, these are the kinds of traffic shifts that, like you said, that network operators dream about. It's like, okay, what's going to happen if, I take down this link, or what's going to happen if suddenly a huge fraction of my traffic shifts from one endpoint to another? These are the kinds of situations that typically operators only get to play out in simulation, right? With all the lack of fidelity that most simulations have. And so, it's good news that there was no massive meltdown. And at the same time, I think it's also good news that now there's real data to help us better understand what happens in these kind of situations. Because, as we study what's going on right now to prepare for the next time something like this happens, now we've got a real event that we can study, as opposed to just hypothesizing about what might happen in simulation.
I was just going to say, I think it will be interesting to see what happens in the coming months as, some people might go back to the office part-time or full-time, and seeing those different fluctuations as well.
I was just going to say that's a great point, because as this thing hits so suddenly, it's not really going to end suddenly. It's going to end in stretched out over a period of many months as these things kind of phase back into whatever the new normal ends up being. So that'll be kind of interesting as well.
Absolutely. And I think it'll be interesting to see. What I'm about to offer is really more a behavioral speculation or commentary than networking, but of course it has implications on the network. I mean, it'd be interesting to see, how much of the current behavior sticks, right? So I think looking for bright spots. I think one bright spot is that people have perhaps figured out that video conferencing isn't such a dumpster fire that it was like 15 years ago, right? It actually works pretty well. And so when presented with the opportunity of flying across the country for a 2-hour meeting or hopping on a video call, maybe people will do more of the latter. Maybe we'll see some more work from home patterns as there's presumably a lot of natural experiments going on now in business and sort of organizational behavior, right? If businesses discover that work from home is an effective pattern for N days a week, for certain employees, then some of the patterns we're seeing right now might stick. And I don't know what that means as far as provisioning. I mean, I think certainly we're at an extreme point here as far as peak. With everybody camping out at home, but it'll be interesting to see if the traffic patterns even go back to the way they were. I mean, I suspect that we will see some stickiness.
Yeah, some of the behavior will stick. I think we'll leave it there for now for the sake of time. But Nick Feamster of the University of Chicago, we really appreciate you being on the Light Reading Podcast. Thank you. I want to thank Avast for sponsoring this week's podcast. Avast's award-winning security solutions make it easy for your customers to stay safe online using just one simple interface, no matter how many devices they use, wherever they go, and however they connect. Let Avast help you build a safer digital world for your customers. Learn more at avast.com/partners. That's avast.com/partners. That is it. That's our show. Thanks very much to Nick Feamster for his time and insights today. Thanks to our producer, Tian Fu, for making us sound good even when we don't. Thanks to you, dear listener, because if you weren't paying attention, we would not be able to get away with doing all of this at work. And please do tell a friend to subscribe. And thanks very much for listening to the Light Reading Podcast.